One American city has a murder rate 10 times the national average. That is not a typo. The national murder rate is 5 per 100,000 people. This city sits at 54. Federal prosecutors have tied gang networks to murders, drug markets, and racketeering across all 5 cities on this list. Number 1 will genuinely surprise you, and number 3 has a violent crime rate more than 5 times the US. Baseline with a specific neighborhood that federal filings describe as a war zone. Number 1. Cleveland's violent crime rate is nearly 4 times the US average. Cleveland does not usually make national headlines. That is part of the problem. In 2024, the city recorded 122 homicides. That works out to roughly 33 homicides per 100,000 residents. The national average is 5. So Cleveland's murder rate is more than 6 times higher than the rest of the country. When you add in rapes, robberies, and aggravated assaults, the total violent crime rate hits around 1,342 per 100,000. That is nearly 4 times the US. Baseline. Here is what makes it worse. Federal prosecutors unsealed a superseding indictment describing a violent street gang alleged to control territory in Cleveland, run an open-air drug market in a specific neighborhood, and face charges including RICO conspiracy. That is not rumor. That is a federal court filing. Imagine you are visiting a friend who lives in a neighborhood you do not know. You park your car, walk 2 blocks, and you are inside a territory that a federal indictment describes as controlled by an organized criminal group. That is a real risk in parts of Cleveland. The good news is that 2025 data shows about 16% fewer violent crimes compared to 2024. Progress is real, but the starting point was so high that Cleveland still ranks among the most dangerous cities in the country. Number 2, Baltimore has over 4 times the national violent crime rate. Baltimore has appeared on dangerous city lists for years, but the actual numbers are still shocking. In 2024, the city recorded 194 homicides and over 3,200 robberies. With a population of roughly 568,000, that puts the homicide rate at about 34 per 100,000. Still nearly 7 times the national average. The violent crime rate lands at around 1,627 per 100,000. That is 4.5 times the US baseline. Federal racketeering cases make it clear this is not random. 2 separate DOJ-described enterprises, one referred to as a violent street gang, and another known locally as CCC, face charges, including murder, attempted murder, non-fatal shootings, carjackings, robberies, and narcotics distribution. Both are described as operating throughout Baltimore. Think about what carjackings mean practically. You stop at a red light in an unfamiliar part of the city. You become a target not because of anything you did, but because of where you stopped. That is the documented risk pattern here. 2025 data shows roughly 17.5% fewer violent crimes compared to 2024. That is a meaningful drop. But Baltimore is improving from an extremely high baseline, and it remains one of the most dangerous cities in the United States. Number 3, Detroit's violent crime rate is over 5 times the national average. Detroit carries the highest violent crime rate in this entire top 5. In 2024, the city logged nearly 12,000 violent crimes, with a population of around 645,000. That is roughly 1,843 violent crimes per 100,000 residents, more than 5 times the US average. The homicide rate sits at about 31 per 100,000, still more than 6 times the national figure. But what sets Detroit apart is the volume of aggravated assault, nearly 10,000 in a single year. That is not abstract. That means knives, bats, firearms, serious violence short of murder happening constantly. Federal prosecutors described a specific gang operating on Detroit's east side in a zone they called the Red Zone, bounded by Gratiot Avenue and Kelly Road. between 7 and 8 Mile Road. They documented a gang war with multiple murders and attempted murders tied to that defined territory. Picture driving through that corridor not knowing what you are crossing through. That is the reality. 2025 numbers show about 10% fewer violent crimes than 2024. Progress, but modest. Detroit's base rate remains dangerously high. The aggravated assault numbers alone, even after improvement, are still at a level most cities will never reach in their worst years. Number 4. Memphis has a homicide rate over 8 times the national average. Memphis is where this list gets harder to ignore. The homicide rate in 2024 was approximately 40.8 per 100,000 residents. The national rate is 5. Memphis is more than 8 times that. That is the second highest homicide rate in this entire top 5. Total violent crimes came in at around 10,270, with a population of about 610,000. That is roughly 1,681 per 100,000, nearly 5 times the US baseline. What makes Memphis especially alarming for visitors is where some of this violence happens. Federal gang filings describe members allegedly committing armed robberies at businesses and drive-thru. These are not isolated back alley incidents. These are public commercial spaces. Think about stopping at a fast food drive-thru late at night and being targeted by people with firearms. That is the specific scenario described in federal documents. One gang is described in DOJ filings as allegedly involved in murder, assault, arson, drug trafficking, kidnapping, robbery, and firearms offenses. 2025 numbers show roughly 24.5% fewer violent crimes compared to 2024. That is the biggest improvement in this entire list. But Memphis dropped from such a dangerous level that it still ranks among the top 2 most dangerous cities in this country by homicide rate. Number 5. St. Louis has the highest homicide rate in this entire list. St. Louis is the most dangerous city on this list. Not by total crime volume, it is actually smaller than the others, but by the number that matters most: how likely you are to be killed. In 2024, St. Louis recorded 151 homicides in a city of roughly 279,000 people. That puts the homicide rate at approximately 54 per 100,000. The national rate is 5. St. Louis is nearly 11 times that number. No other city in this top 5 comes close. The total violent crime rate sits at about 1,395 per 100,000, nearly 4 times the US average. The city's own police department called 2024 the lowest homicide count in 11 years. That is supposed to be encouraging, but 54 per 100,000 is still catastrophic. Gun violence is central to how this plays out. Local reports reference decreases in shots fired calls and gunshot detection activations, which means firearm discharges were being tracked routinely enough that reductions became a metric. Federal prosecutors have described a violent street gang based in St. Louis tied to murders and drug trafficking conspiracies, with multi-agency initiatives specifically focused on gang-linked violence in the city. 2025 data shows about 12% fewer violent crimes than 2024. Improvement is real. The risk is still extraordinary. The most dangerous place is not always the one that looks dangerous. Look up the specific neighborhoods before you travel, not just the city name, because risk is concentrated in blocks, not zip codes. If you are someone who wants to make decisions based on real data and not just headlines, subscribe. The next video breaks down what the crime statistics actually mean for your daily life, and it changes how you read the news.